Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me along, Steve. Really appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And you're joining me from, let me get the pronunciation right, Mululaba in Queensland's Sunshine Coast. Is that right?
Mooloolaba, yeah,
Mululaba.
just
I
just
thought there
south
might
of
have been a
Mooloolaba
slight
in
tweak
Corona.
to it there.
You'll
So,
have to come up for a visit, and we'll teach you
oh, mate,
properly.
I look forward to it. As long as the surf's good, I am there. I know
Oh, it's
you.
very good.
I know you spent a bit of time living in Sydney, in Surrey Hills, and over in LA at Marina Del Rey, Venice Beach, one of my favorite places to visit. How's life on the Sunshine Coast compare?
Yeah, it's great here, and yeah, we're kind of thanking our lucky stars that we moved back to my wife and two kids and I moved back to Australia early last year or the
Hmm.
start of last year, and we were going to go to Sydney, but my stepdad's got a beach house on the Sunshine Coast, and so we came and figured we'd spend a month here before we went down to Sydney, and we just fell in love with it, and yeah, kind of counting our lucky stars that we ended up doing that because it's a reasonably isolated place to begin with, and so,
Yeah.
so lifestyle change for the last few months with coronavirus and everything has been it's been probably better. It's been an okay place to be. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think Australia in general, I was looking at the stats earlier today, less than 100 fatalities. And I contrast that with another podcast guest I've got on the show later today, Alex Osterwalder, who's over in Switzerland, much smaller place, but about 1,500 deaths. So I think we are
Wow.
quite lucky down here in Australia, the way things have uh,
Uh,
unfolded, at least thus far. But anyways, we can talk about coronavirus all day, and that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about your backstory, your work with Shoes of Prey, lessons learned, and of course what you're doing today. But before you got into the entrepreneurial space, you studied to be a lawyer.
that's right. Yeah. Yep. I studied commerce law at the University of Queensland.
Yep.
Went and worked as a lawyer for almost a year. Got qualified as a solicitor on the Wednesday. My last day was the Friday. I was out of there pretty quick.
So yeah, I saw that you're over at Clayton Utz, or Klutz as they're known in the industry,
That's it.
for less than a year. So why did you get out? What was it about law that didn't tickle your fancy?
Yeah, I probably should have been smarter and worked it out beforehand, but just yeah, Laura and I just didn't suit and particularly at a big commercial firm. Like it's yeah, it suits a kind of more introverted person who yeah likes to focus on kind of detailed technical problems,
Hmm.
and I'm just kind of the opposite. So I would end up I'd had like my own office with a nice view, and the lawyers would normally sort of shut the door to their office and lock themselves away for 4 or 5 hours reading legislation and putting together advices, and I would like leave my door open, and people would walk past my office, and I'd go, "Hi, Caroline, come in and say hi," as they like kind of went past. Like I'm a much more kind of extroverted person. I kind of thrive on people energy, and I found myself kind of I'd get to the end of the day, I'd get the train home, and just would forget what I'd been working on that day. I'd come back in the next morning and just completely forget, like I just wasn't engaged or interested in
Mm.
the work at all. And then I was sitting on the train, this is, oh, now I feel old, this is like nearly 20 years ago, sitting on the train riding on the ride home, and I'd be reading the Business Review Weekly and reading about all these entrepreneurs doing interesting things and people in the
Yeah.
business world doing interesting things. And that's what I was wanting to read about in my spare time. So then I kind of put two and two together and figured, well, maybe I should go and work in that space if that's what I'm
Mm.
finding more interesting than my day job as a lawyer.
Yeah, yeah. I do remember reading the now defunct BRW, and it was always quite the inspiring read. And I guess for a lot of people who, many of which may be listening, many of whom may be listening to this show, they may have gone to university for a number of years, gotten the degree, gotten the job, and then find themselves in a situation where you've put all this energy and time into something that it's hard to leave, even though deep down you might be, say, miserably comfortable, as I like to say. So it sounds like for you, though, you didn't have that difficulty. I mean, or did you?
Um, yeah, I'd probably describe it as miserably uncomfortable for me. Like
Yeah.
there wasn't really a lot. I mean, yeah, and I guess I also am probably a bit less risk averse than other people.
Hmm.
Actually, I remember having a conversation with, as a grad at Clayton Utz, you had a mentor, and I remember having a conversation with my mentor, and I was in the property department at the time, and he sat me down and said, "Michael, I don't think you really enjoy being a lawyer. Let me give you one piece of advice: get out while you still can. I'm middle aged. I've got a mortgage. I've got a wife. I hate my job. I hate my life, but I can't get out because the salary's too good. So get out while you still can. Yeah. And this was my mentor. Like he was like this balding, short, overweight, middle-aged man, and I could, it was like, okay, this is good advice. Thank you, mentor. I'll take your advice. I sort of even thought about. I sort of figured it out before then too. But
that's fantastic. Yeah. I think everybody could do with a mentor like that in their early formative years. And I've met countless people in the same sort of situation in their mid-40s, mid-50s who don't necessarily like what they do, but they've leveraged to the hilt. They've got all these assets they're paying off. They're putting their kids through private school. And the only way they're going to continue to maintain that lifestyle is to keep that job that they don't necessarily love. But fortunately, in your case, you got out early, which created a lot of space and time to think about new ideas, new ventures, one of which became Birds of Prey back in 2009, a company you set up with your current ex-wife, then wife, Jodie Fox. For our audience members who may not be familiar with Birds of Prey, I'm very familiar with the company. I remember reading about you guys in all the outlets, BRW and so on back in the day. What did Birds of Prey do?
Yeah, slip of the tongue, shoes of prey.
Oh,
lots of people.
Where do I get?
Lots of this happens all the time.
That's hilarious. Shoes of prey, of course. My bad. So I must have had some kind of Freudian slip or something when I was writing down my notes for this, and I wrote Birds of Prey for some reason. So what did Shoes of Prey do, Michael?
Well, it's good because that's kind of where the name stemmed from, was like birds of prey, this kind of hunting aspect, and that took us to Shoes of Prey. So clearly the kind of imagery and theory behind the name, it works.
Indeed.
For those who don't know, you could basically design your own shoes on our website. It was like women's fashion shoes, like high heels, ballet flats, boots. You could design them on our website, change the toe shape, the heel height and type, leathers, colors, materials. And then we made the shoes and delivered them to you. Yeah.
So you guys were essentially self-funded for the first, say, 2.5 years. So you grew organically. Are you able to reveal what sort of numbers you were doing before you actually went to market and started to raise capital?
Yeah, you've really done your research, Steve.
Except on the name, clearly.
Maybe you're too immersed in it. It kind of got into your head. About 2.5, 3 years, we just self-funded. We're probably doing $2 or $3 million a year in revenue. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say actually probably $2.5 million a year in revenue by that sort of 2.5, 3 year mark in the life of the business.
Yep. And so at that point, you then decided, okay, we want to scale this thing, and you went off and raised some capital from the likes of Greycroft over in the States, Blue Sky, Blackbird, Nordstrom, the big retailer in the US, Mike Cannon Brooks from Atlassian, and all in all, from what my numbers tell me, you raised about $30 million US. Is that more or less it?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, I think 25, 26 million US dollars.
Fantastic. So the question is, obviously, when startups go out to market to raise capital, it's to scale, to take this thing bigger and better. But perhaps the deeper philosophical question is, why the need to go bigger and better as opposed to grow organically? You're making $2.5 million a year. You could arguably keep growing that, maintain that control of the business. Why the desire to 10x this thing or 100x this thing? Where do you think that came from? Because I see a lot of startups do this, and oftentimes it ends up being somewhat of a trap that they fall into. So keen to unpack that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it was a couple of things for us. So firstly, we'd done well in this niche of women who were really passionate about customizing, and our core customer she was like really creative. She kind of worked in some kind of creative or artistic sort of field. She had a really strong sense of her own kind of style and design. And she loved the idea of being able to create something and wear it. It was almost like create a piece of art that became a piece of fashion that she could wear. And so that's a pretty small niche segment of people. But we did incredibly well in that niche segment, like NPS scores in the 90s. we didn't really have to advertise, just word of mouth within that segment. And we also had a couple of sub niches that worked well. So wedding shoes was a really good category for us, and then odd sizes, because we could do really small, large, wide and narrow sizes because we were manufacturing on demand and not holding stock. So we were doing really well in these niches, and growing the business organically, sort of cash flow break even. But we had literally tens of thousands of women coming to the site every day who weren't buying. And so, naturally we kind of did our market research with talked to these people, these customers, and, ran surveys, focus groups to understand who this customer was. And she was obviously interested, but why wasn't she buying? And what came out of all that research was that this was a mass market fashion customer. She loved the concept of designing her own shoes, which is why she was coming to the site. But there were 3 reasons that she gave that she wasn't buying. She said, I'd love to design my own shoes, but I need a more simplified shoe design experience. What you've created for this creative customer, it's very free form. It's a bit too complex for me. I needed to be guided through the design process. Secondly, I want a faster turnaround time. We were taking 5 weeks to make and deliver the shoes. This mass market customer was often buying shoes for an event 2 weeks away. So she said, I need a sub 2-week delivery time. And then thirdly, she said, I like the concept, but I don't really want to pay a premium. And at the time, we were charging a 30% premium over the same quality shoes, which that creative customer or wedding or sizing customer was willing to pay. So we looked at those 3 things that this mass market customer wanted, and we realized this is not going to be easy to do, but we can execute on these things. To do that, we're going to need to build out our user experience, software engineering, product management team to simplify the shoe design experience, and then we need to go and build our own shoe factory to bring the lead times down and the unit costs down. For the first 2.5 years, we were working with an external supplier, and they didn't want to scale really and fix those things. And there was no other manufacturer in the world who could do custom women's shoes. So if we wanted to solve those things, we're going to have to do the manufacturing ourselves. So we looked at that, and we're confident we could do those things. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take capital. And so that's when we went out and raised money from the venture capital firms to go and execute on serving that mass market customer. So I suppose it's a long-winded answer to your question. So I suppose the motivations were we could see that there was this it looked like there was this big opportunity. All these customers, mass market customers, were interested in what we were doing, and our market research showed that we could, that there was a way to tap into this mass market customer and sort of change our business model to serving them. And it was going to be, if that worked, that was going to be a massive business and kind of an industry changing business. We're excited. I guess we're also excited by the idea of building that kind of business rather than staying in our niche.
So it sounds like there was this underlying sort of tension essentially that drove you in that direction, whereby you were getting, say, 10,000 women a day visiting the website, but the majority weren't buying. And therefore it was like this cognitive dissonance. We've got this website, but all these people coming along to our website, let's better serve them. But to do that, we need to go off and raise capital. So totally get that. So you raised that capital, like we said earlier, about 26 million US dollars. And then you built the factory, you put in place processes, you improved the UI, did all these things. At your peak, you employed something like 200 people. I'd love for you to unpack sort of that journey from raising capital to growing the business up until the point whereby things were looking that like they weren't actually going to get to the target. Because when you raised that capital, what was your ultimate goal in terms of say revenue, for example?
Yeah. So the goal was to change the way the shoe industry worked, and the fashion industry. Like the fashion industry is very, very inefficient with the way it operates. Basically, in the supply chain, like companies try to predict and forecast what demand is going to be, and then supply chains are kind of 6 to 12 months long. So fashion brands have to try and forecast. What are we now? We're in May 2020. So fashion companies now are working on the products that they're going to be launching in for winter in Australia, May 2021. Yep. And it's pretty hard to forecast. Fashion trends change. So they might be forecasting. Okay, we think we think red shoes are going to be popular this season, red ballet flats. So they're going to have to start designing and ordering, tens of thousands of red ballet flats now for 12 months out, and they'll get that demand forecast wrong. It's basically impossible to get it right. And so that's why at the end of every season you see fashion brands putting the product that didn't sell on sale. So trying to get people to buy stuff that they wouldn't otherwise buy by discounting it, and that's inefficient. It's bad for the margins for the fashion brand. People aren't necessarily getting what they really want. They're just getting a discount to prompt them to buy it. And then vice versa, stuff might sell really well and sells out, and then people miss out and the brands miss out on the extra money they could have made there. So our mission was to try and change all of that by moving to a on-demand manufacturing model and just shorten the supply chain from 12 months down to 2 weeks is what we're delivering in 11 days. So if we were able to achieve that, in theory, we could have even in just in the shoe category been hundreds of millions of dollar revenue business, and then applying that into other categories in fashion, we could have been a multi-billion-dollar business. So that was the kind of big picture objective and dream.
Yeah. So obviously shooting for the stars, the unicorn status, but I guess you had a number of wins along that journey. I mean, you set up distribution deals with the likes of David Jones here in Australia, Nordstrom in the United States. And like I said, I remember reading about Shoes of Prey in all sorts of Australian tech startup media, American media. You guys were up there with Canva in terms of poster child or poster children for the startup ecosystem here. But what happened then? I mean, you did all this market research, your NPS score was in the 90s, everything was telling you this is what the mass market wanted, but did it?
Yeah, so we grew over the period. We grew from that sort of 2.5 million revenue to over the next 5 years. As we executed all of those things, we got the delivery times down from 5 weeks to 11 days. We brought our retail price down by 30%, so we were not charging a premium, and we simplified the shoe design experience so you could basically, instead of being a free-form designer, you could shop a range of existing shoes and then you could modify those designs. So we executed, it took us 5 years, and grew to sort of 200 people to do all of this, and we raised the $26 million over 4 rounds of funding, so it was kind of a gradual progress. I think our first round was about $2 million, and then our last one was $15.5 million. So we kind of had growth along the 5 years as we implemented everything and brought on partners like Nordstrom, who are the biggest retailer of women's fashion shoes in the US. They were kind of bought into the concept working too. But we basically, over the 5 years, we grew, but we just didn't grow enough. So, all our market research, if our market research had been right, we should have gotten to, 100 million in revenue over those 5 years. We needed to be, now we had these fixed costs of a big software engineering team and a shoe factory in China. We needed to be at about 30 million revenue to be breaking even, but we were only at about 12 million revenue. So we'd grown kind of 5x from the 2.5 that we were at before, but we needed to grow a lot more than that. And now we'd built the value proposition that this mass market customer wanted. We could actually watch how she was behaving on the website rather than just asking her what she wanted. What we realized was this mass market customer, consciously she thinks she wants to customize. If you ask her, she loves the idea of designing her own shoes, and she gave some good valid reasons for why she wasn't ordering. But deep down, subconsciously, she doesn't really want to design her own shoes. She actually just wants to see what's popular on Instagram and in fashion magazines and buy not only that design, but even buy that brand. So what she consciously thinks she wants and what we built is actually almost the opposite, almost the polar opposite of what she actually deep down subconsciously wants. And we could see that and we could draw that out once we built the value proposition, but our market research didn't uncover that. So it was kind of in the end, a failure in our market research. We heard what the customer consciously wanted, and we, in hindsight, should have delved down. And it would have been hard, to be fair, it would have been really hard to do. Yeah. But we should have delved down into her subconscious to try and really understand. And we kind of failed to do that. So we just didn't get anywhere near the growth rates that we needed to get to.
Yep. And I guess that's a delicate balance because what customers say, what customers do are often two different things, but it's not like you didn't have any validation. Like you said, you went through 4 funding rounds over the 5 years, raising the 26 mil, you 5x revenue. And I guess for a lot of startups who are in the early stages of a company, like they look for any form of numbers, leading indicators, signups, sales to help validate that their assumptions underpinning the business are true. So when you're looking at these numbers, when you're raising capital, all of that points you to this is working. But I guess it was just a matter of it's not working enough to justify the growth targets, to pay back investors and everything else, which is one of the challenges with raising capital, whereby you now need to hit these very aggressive growth targets. So when it comes to tapping into, say, the underlying subconscious, as you put it a few moments ago, of the customer to hone in on what they really, really want, I mean, do you have any thoughts about what you do in that space? Maybe some things that you're applying to your new business, Fable Food Co, that you would have done differently if you were to live the Shoes of Prey story again?
Yeah. So yeah, it's another really good question, and this kind of keeps me up at night. Thinking of applying it to my new business, because it was, it kind of cost me 10 years with Shoes of Prey and cost a lot of money for our investors. So I'd spent a lot of time thinking about it, and kind of where I've gotten to is like, if you're trying to do something for Shoes of Prey, we were trying to do something completely new. Like no one had built a value proposition for the mass market customer designing women's fashion shoes. You could design handbags, you could design Nike sneakers, but there wasn't anything exactly the same as us. So we couldn't go and watch consumer behavior to understand what the customer wanted. We had to do an earlier phase of research, basically just talking to customers. And I think that's really hard. And I don't know, even with the benefit of hindsight, I don't know how we could have. We should have delved deeper down into that consumer psychology, but I don't know how we would have done that. I still haven't got wrapped my head around that. But I think the way I'm applying this learning into Fable Food Company and a way to get around this issue is to operate in a category where you can go and watch how consumers behave, and then talk to them about their behaviors. People can say one thing but go and do another thing. So if you can actually watch them do the other thing, you're going to get much better insights. So for what I'm doing now, it's a meat alternative to slow cooked meats made primarily from mushrooms and other all natural plant based ingredients. So it's like a pulled pork or a braised beef or a beef brisket meat alternative.
All my favorites.
And so for my yeah, perfect. Me too. Before I was vegetarian, anyway. So for me, the market research for this category, there are existing meat alternatives on the market, not replicating these type of meats, but replicating like minced beef and chicken and other products. And so I can go into Coles and Woolies and I can watch consumers shopping those products. I can see what products they pick up. I can see them turn the packet around and read what's on the packet. I can see them put one product down, pick up another product, and then read it and ultimately put that in their shopping basket. And then a little bit creepily, I can go and ask them all sorts of questions about what was it about that product that you picked up and put down that stopped you buying it? What was it about the one that you picked up that and that you're buying now? Why did you buy that one? And what other products have you eaten in the category? What did you like about them? What didn't you like about them? And that's much kind of, in my mind, better, more accurate market research than just asking the customer without watching their behavior. So I guess that's how I've got around this issue with my latest venture.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, and I guess that aligns with some of the philosophies out there or methodologies like your human-centered design approach, where it's more so about observing how customers behave in the real world, standing in their shoes, developing real empathy with them, rather than just, say, focus groups where we have people who are paid to be there and we ask them what they think and would you pay for this? And they inevitably say yes because it's easier to say that than say no. But when push comes to shove, they just don't, because they've got so many other competing demands on their wallet's attention, so to speak.
Yep.
But we'll definitely touch a little bit more on Fable Food Co. and what you're working on there. But with Shoes of Prey, Obviously, there were some challenges around the market demands and not really keeping up with the projections, but there were other challenges as well. I mean, you guys were trying to build an ethical company in terms of the manufacturing process. And from what I understand, you're competing in a market whereby perhaps every other company, particularly the mass market companies, may not be as ethical in their approach to operations, to the supply chain, to the manufacturing side of things. And therefore, it's harder to maintain margins at scale when competing with them and still keep your prices low. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about that sort of dilemma of trying to be ethical in an industry where other people aren't quite as fair play as Shoes of Prey was trying to be.
Yeah, so ultimately, those weren't the reasons that we failed. It was the market research piece. But yeah, this was an interesting area for us, But we built a shoe factory in China, and we owned and operated that shoe factory. And there's not many Western brands that will do that. Most Western brands won't own and operate the factory. They'll source from various kind of Chinese-owned and operated factories. At least in the shoe industry, that's the case. And so yeah, it did. Owning and operating our own factory did throw up some challenges for us. Like we did, we as you kind of pointed out, we did everything legally right in China, and we also did a whole bunch of things that were ethically the right things to do. So things around the types of glues that we were using in the shoes, making sure that they didn't have any kind of toxic chemicals in them that would be bad for the environment or bad for our workers. And that's not common in shoemaking in China. Making sure we had the right ventilation systems so that the factories were properly ventilated, ensuring that our workers only worked a set number of hours. We didn't force people to work unpaid overtime, and we paid overtime correctly when we were paying it. All the right sort of hiring and termination policies in place, and all those things just aren't commonly done in China. Making sure we had all of the right regulations to run the factory and the right licenses to run the factory. Feeding our workers well. We provided breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the factory, and so doing all of those things came with extra costs. On the flip side, there were some really good benefits for us out of doing that. Not just ethical benefits, but actual business benefits. Mm-hmm. So we had we had almost no unwanted employee turnover in the sort of 6 or 7 years that we were operating the factory in China. So it's normal in China. Chinese New Year is a huge celebration in China. A lot of workers in the shoe industry will come to Southeast China, sort of Dongguan, Guangzhou. That region is kind of the shoe capital of the world, really. A lot of migrant workers from other parts of China will come to that region. They'll work through the year, then they'll go home to their families for a couple of weeks for Chinese New Year. And it's normal for a shoe factory after Chinese New Year, workers come back. Normally you would lose about 25% of your workforce, and then you'd have to because the people would. That's a good time to change jobs, or good time to go back home and stay at home. We literally had zero turnover after Chinese New Year. Like everyone came back, and it was because we did all of these things properly. It's because we provided great food. We provided areas for people to sleep at lunch, which is often what happens with workers in factories. Provided sort of good beds, ping pong tables for people to play on, and we paid overtime correctly. They could see that what we're doing was environmentally safe, and so that super low or non-existent unwanted turnover is obviously a massive help for us running a business, because we didn't have to, when Chinese New Year came back, we didn't have the next sort of couple of months disrupted with having to hire new workers and train new workers, and so there were some really good benefits for us in business benefits for us in doing that. And in some senses, it was easier for us to be a really good employer because no one else in the industry over there was doing those things.
Yeah. And I think that's also a valuable lesson for companies who perhaps don't necessarily have factories in China or in Southeast Asia, but just running companies in general in the West. Like, take care of your people, invest in the aspirational working conditions, everything else. I mean, it might cost you money up front, but you're more likely to acquire engage and retain your best talent. And over time, that's a compounding. There's a compounding effect that takes hold, and your company ends up benefiting, because if you don't put that stuff in place, then your best talent's just going to walk, right? Then you're not going to retain them as you would if you didn't have that stuff in place. So, so when the wheels came off the chariot, so to speak, after riding this wave of growth, 5x growth, raising all the capital, all the media attention, I imagine for you as the founder of this company, I mean, obviously it would have been very, very difficult to come from those highs and ultimately crashing down. And we'll talk about the media response, because it was obviously very unfair in many respects. I mean, when you're building a startup, 95% of startups fail. Even something like 1% of venture-backed companies get to the $1 billion plus exit. So it's a very, very, it's a very much a matter of threading the needle, and you're likely to fail, but it's a matter of actually trying to get there in the first place. And as was it Theodore Roosevelt who said, it's about being in the arena. And that's something that I think a lot of media don't get. But for you personally, I mean, how did it feel? I mean, from the perspective of humility and ego, and perhaps feeling like maybe you let investors and other people around you down. I just love to unpack like the emotions and you went through and how you got through that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tough sort of 18 months, that sort of ending period of Shoes of Prey. So yeah, we kind of came to the realization in sort of late 2017 that we'd executed on all these things that mass market customer wanted, and we just weren't getting the growth, and we started to watch the behavior on our site, and came to those realizations that this wasn't what the mass market customer wanted, and our market research was wrong. So we looked to try and pivot and adjust. So we went back and looked at, okay, well, the niches that we did well in, we still do well in. Can we double down on those niches and build a large enough business? So we went and did a bunch of research on that creative niche, the wedding customer and the sizing customer. And we identified, there's good opportunities in all those niches, but the challenge was they're just all quite small and difficult to operate in niches. Wedding is a very competitive, expensive category to advertise in and target customers. The shoe sizing is actually a potentially really large market, because most people are wearing the wrong size shoes. But the problem is they don't know that. And so it's a complex thing. You've got to educate people on what's the right size. You've got to measure their foot, then you've got to deliver them a shoe, and fit's subjective. So even if it's technically the right size shoe, they might not like it. So that was a bunch of challenges in that category. And the creative niche is just small. So we did a bunch of research and about a bunch of testing in each of those niches, and we just couldn't see a path to building a business to that would get us relatively quickly to break even and covering our fixed costs. So and so doing that was a process sort of over 12 months or so of investigating all those niches, and we had to lay off employees to try and bring our cash burn down, to give us time to investigate these categories. So we did like three rounds of layoffs. So we went from 200 people down to kind of 150. Then we did a much bigger round down to about 80. Got down to sort of 30, and then in the end just had to pull the plug. I mean, the emotions through all of that, I mean, it was tough. Like, having gone through the highs of all of the, all the great things that we'd been through over the 6 or 7 years, and leading up to that, to having all of the, realizing that the dream wasn't going to play out, the vision wasn't going to play out, the consumer didn't want what we'd spent so long building. Team of people, we'd had our headquarters in Sydney with 25 people. We'd moved 23 of those 25 had moved with us to Los Angeles when we set up our headquarters in the US. So we had this team of people who'd been with us and literally moved to the other side of the world with us, having to let go of those people. And then, visas in the US are tied to the company. So people then were, had to either quickly find another job in the US or move back to Australia, and these were our friends as well as our colleagues. Stresses of that, to this great workforce that we built up in China. We'd had our longest serving employee. She was employee number 2 at the company, so she'd been with us through the whole 10-year journey. She didn't speak any English, so my relationship with her was it was a really funny relationship.
Just
like we had
hand gestures.
Yeah, we had this strong personal connection because we'd been working together for 10 years, but we always had to speak through a translator. So, laying off people like her was just, emotionally tough. And then, as you touched on, the Australian press is not the most forgiving of failure. And, the press, you can rationalize it. Like, the journalists will do what gets readership and what gets eyeballs onto their site, gives them advertising clicks, and it's a much more exciting story to talk about a business failing. That gets clicks, and so that's why journalists write about it. So you can rationalize it, but it still kind of hurts to see all of that sort of written about in the press. And then ultimately having to leave the US myself because I didn't have a job anymore, and my visa was expiring, and my wife was about 7 months pregnant. So we also we didn't want to get stuck in the US with Katrina unable to fly. And, it was a lot of personal things kind of thrown in the mix.
Yep.
I mean, I guess what kind of helped get me through it all, though, was my son was kind of born actually at the start of all of those challenging periods. And I think in some ways that was actually really helpful for me to, it felt like up until then that Shoes of Prey was my entire world and existence. When Elliot was born, puts all of that into perspective. And, Elliot was healthy, my wife was healthy, we had another baby on the way. Just that's like 100 times more important than sort of a business. And so I think that perspective kind of helped me to both rationalize and even emotionally kind of get through that whole period. But it was definitely tough. I mean, I left Shoes of Prey middle of 2018, and I needed a break, so took 6 months off. To sort of I guess kind of get over some of the stress of that and just make sure my mental health was all okay. And I think it was similar for Jodie going through that journey, and even some of our other team who'd been with us for a long time.
So a couple of things I wanted to double click on there, Michael, one of which was the layoffs. I mean, these people who came over to the US with you, some of the Chinese factory workers who'd been there from day one. How did you go about letting go of people in a way that perhaps was, say, laced with, say, empathy, rather than just saying, all right, we got to let you go? I imagine you had a process you went through that was a little bit more cognizant of the relationships that you had with these people and the fact that they are people, rather than just a very cold, you're fired approach that Donald Trump might take on The Apprentice, right? So I'd love to understand how you went about that.
It was, I guess it was, I think a few things with the, it's a good question. I think at the time it wasn't even a conscious thought on how to do this in an empathetic way, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think there were some things that we did that made the whole process kind of more empathetic, and means I've got good relationships with a lot of our most of our ex-employees. I think it was a few things. Keeping them informed of the whole journey, and that kind of happened naturally. I guess we were a very open culture in the company anyway, so they were across what our objectives were, and they could see we were executing on all these things and delivering what we thought the value proposition was that the customer wanted. They could see all that happening. They could see that sales weren't going the way that they needed to go. So they were sort of part of that whole journey, and it was obvious to them, like it was to us, that this isn't working as we expect. So something's going to have to change. So we were very open. That open culture, I think, made things easier. And then with the benefit of hindsight, I think one of the other things that helped was like me kind of taking responsibility and doing the communication to people directly when we had to lay them off. So we, Jodie and I, kind of, when we actually physically communicated the layoff. So as an example, in our Santa Monica office, one of the layoffs, we had to let go of half the Santa Monica office. So it was about 20 people staying, 20 people leaving. People were kind of across something was going to have to happen soon anyway. Jodie and I we pulled the whole team together. We explained the situation, and this is really shitty thing that we have to do, but we have to try and pivot to go and operate in these other categories. We need to test if they can work. We need to extend our runway to give us time to make that work.
Yeah.
We for the survival of the business, we can't keep everybody on, and so then we split the people into the two groups. There was the group that was staying, the group that was leaving. I communicated to the group that was leaving. Jodie communicated directly to the group that was staying. We had all of the details worked out of, we had kind of generous as we could, severance packages. A lot of those people were Australians living in the US, so they were going to have visa issues. So we'd worked out all of the details of that and had an explanation of what the process was for their visas, all prepped for them on a page. And what was going to happen with their health insurance, which is important in the US, and we were going to pay that for a period of time afterwards. So we thought through, okay, if I was in the position of being laid off right now,
mm-hmm.
what's the what would be stressing me out, and what's the information that the company could provide that would help lower those stress levels, as well as me communicating that as opposed to getting our HR manager or somebody else to communicate that. I think those were the things that helped. And actually, interestingly, I read an article this morning from Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, and it was a letter from, it was kind of basically a transcript of, they just unfortunately had to lay off 25% of their workforce today, 1,900 people.
Yeah.
And it was they've published what he said in that meeting to the team, word for word, and I, in my limited experience, laying off 1,900 people is much harder than what we had to do, but he nailed what he said there. Like he delivered the message himself. He's mapped out all of those same things, what it means for people. He's even done, for him there, he's doing, I think he had to do it in three phases, like 10 a.m. in San Francisco time to the Americans, 6 p.m. for the people in the Asia Pacific, and then he's up at midnight communicating to the people in Europe that they're laying off. I think that he's done that's a really empathetic way to do it. So yeah, we didn't. I haven't got records of what I said, but if you're interested in this space, and if you've got to do this yourself, go and have a read of what he said, because I think he did a really good job of that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you guys were quite empathetic, even though you say there was no real sort of conscious thought put into the process. One thing you touched on there was about being transparent with people, so they know the journey, they know the goals, they know how you're tracking. Now it's kind of like a delicate balance from where I'm sitting, that on one side you want to be as transparent as possible, but at the same time you want to inspire your team. You want to motivate them. You want them to believe in the mission. So if you're being transparent and the numbers are suggesting that, hey, we're not really getting closer to our goal, we've been working on this for a couple of years, we're struggling. At the same time, like that's not going to inspire people. So, how do you navigate that delicate balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and that was a learning journey for me too. Like I think early on in the life of Choose a Prey, I wanted to be the person like delivering the upbeat, positive messages. And actually, it was easier to do early in the life of the business because we were doing well, and there were upbeat, positive messages to deliver. But when things started to not work out, my natural tendency is to be optimistic and positive and put a positive spin on things. But I realized pretty quickly that was not having the effect that I wanted, because there was this juxtaposition then for the team of like, well, hang on, our numbers, we're like at 70% of target, now we're at 65% of target, now we're at 60% of target. Like it's not all positive. So stop being so positive and optimistic, Michael. And we start like people started to then ask me like, hang on, are you actually aware of, like, are you living in some dream world of positivity? So like early on, it wasn't natural to me, but I pretty quickly realized that it was having the opposite effect, being positive, and I actually needed to be realistic about things, and people appreciated it when I was, because they actually got inspired by the idea and the challenge of, okay, well, what we're doing is not working. How do we figure out why it's not working, and how do we try and fix that? That was actually way more inspiring for the team than a message that was clearly not true. I learned that.
No, I think that's very valuable, particularly for leaders listening to this in these times of COVID-19 who may be struggling with revenue just going south and having to do layoffs or introduce pay cuts and things like that. It pays to just be transparent about where things are. And if you've got values aligned people on the bus who really believe in what the company's trying to do, if their hearts are in the right place, then they're more likely to respond to that than say, oh, looks like we're going to be out of a job and leave. Because if they're going to leave at the first sign of difficulty, then perhaps they're not the best people that you want on the bus anyways. But the other thing you also said was around the fact that your son was born a couple of months before you moved. You were going to move back to Sydney, to Australia rather, and how having family, having a son meant that there was something else that was much bigger than shoes of prey. And I think for a lot of startup entrepreneurs, they might have invested themselves completely into this one thing and completely neglected every other dimension of life. And then when this one thing is taken away from you, it can be absolutely debilitating. You can go off into a, depressive episode that you may not emerge from for years. So I guess it's just really important to try, as difficult as it is when you're trying to build something like a $100 million company, to cultivate other aspects of your life as well. So if that one thing is taken away from you, you still have relationships, friendships, your health, and other things that you derive a sense of, say, identity and say, fulfillment from.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing to do. And to be fair, I probably hadn't really done it very well until my kids were born. Yeah, I threw everything into shoes of prey, and that was definitely my life and my identity, and almost my reason. Felt like almost my reason for existence. And then, in some ways, I suppose it was. I was fortunate that I had before things got really bad. I kind of had kids and had put that into perspective. But even had that not have happened, I think one of the big learnings for me was just how, like, for me personally, my journey through this, like how quickly my kind of life and happiness turned around from going through this really tough 18-month, even just the career side of my life, even just focusing in on that, like going through this incredibly tough and painful 18-month period, to then I took 6 months off to have a break, and literally just had a break, kind of was a parent and just did whatever I felt like doing for the 6 months. I didn't put any pressure on it, on trying to work out what I was going to do next. And I played computer games, I read a lot of books, and just kind of went whatever I wanted to do, and wherever my intellectual curiosity took me. And then that, and we can sort of talk about it in more detail if you like, but that ultimately led to what I'm doing now, to moving back to Australia, living on the Sunshine Coast. And I wrote a blog post early last year about how 2019 was the best year of my life. And just kind of delving into the reasons why. It was like just a complete turnaround from where my 2017 and early 2018 had been. And the realization for me out of that was like, it can feel like at the time, like this is when Shoes of Prey was ending, it felt like, this is almost my whole world kind of coming to an end. But that's really not. That it turned out not to be the case, and I literally bounced back from one of the hardest years of my life to one of the best over took a 12-month period to turn around. But there's light at the. I guess the message I would share with other people is, if you're going through a really tough period like that, in my experience, there can be that light at the end of the tunnel, and it doesn't feel like it in the moment where you might be now, but it worked out that way for me, and I think it can for other people too.
Yeah, and I think that's common, whether it's in business or just in life. Sometimes you go through really debilitating episodes. It could be a cancer scare or something like that, and providing you survive that, you come out of it with a newfound lease on life. You reflect on what really matters to you, and you do more of the things that do matter. And I did read your blog post, and I know in your case it was meaningful work, family, location, and less commuting, just giving you more freedom to do the things that you want to do that were really important. And it makes me think of the Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's biggest hedge funds, like 150 billion under management. He tells a story of building up his firm in the 80s to, I think it was 50 odd people, millions under management at that point. And then the stock market crash hit. He was wrong about his projections and he essentially had to fire everyone. He was the last person left. He had to borrow $4,000 from his dad to cover some short-term payments. He felt like an absolute failure, but he says that was the best thing that ever happened to him because it forced him to change the way he makes decisions. And it's those decisions that have helped him build this monolithic hedge fund. And it's those decisions that he encoded in his book, Principles, which went on to be a New York Times bestseller and like just absolutely crazy influential. So there is a lot to be said about dark times and what is it? It's always darkest before the dawn, essentially. But
yeah,
on venture
his book.
Yep.
Well, I was just going to say that book, Principles, is one of the ones I read in that 6 months I had in the wilderness. And yeah, awesome book.
Yeah.
One of the best books I've read in the last few years, I reckon. I highly recommend it. Which
Likewise.
Yeah, you've obviously it's influenced you too. Yeah.
Big time. It's definitely one of the top 10 books I've ever read, I would say, in terms of its impact on my life and the way I see things. But for people who perhaps don't want to read a several hundred-page book, they should just check out his...
It's a big one.
Yeah, he's got a lot of videos on Principles online that are really well-produced that are about 25 minutes long. So that's a good gateway drug, if you will. But back to Shoes of Prey. One thing I wanted to touch on in the short amount of time we have left is venture capital. A lot of startups out there think that they absolutely need to positively raise venture capital, and a tool is only as good as how you use it. And in some cases, it may force startups into a place where they're now accountable to obviously VCs, general partners. There may be conflicts of interest at play. If I'm a VC, I want to return the ROI to our limited partners. If I'm a startup, I might want to go in a different direction and not be as aggressive in my hiring and marketing and product development and everything else. So, I mean, has your view of venture capital changed in any way? And if so, how?
Yeah, so no, I think you make a good point. It's a venture capital is a tool that, if used in the right way, can be really beneficial for your business. But it's not a tool that fits every set of circumstances, and it shouldn't be used in every set of circumstances. So, yeah, with the benefit of hindsight with Shoes of Prey, we should have stayed focused in on those niches that we were doing well in. We probably could have built a $30, $40, $50 million business in those niches over a 10-year period. We could have done that organically, and we could have built a nice little profitable business. Wasn't necessarily going to change the world, but was still going to be a good business. That's with the benefit of hindsight. I certainly don't blame the VCs for the direction that we went, because our issue was going back to, it was the market research was wrong. Our market research said this could be an industry-changing business. We needed capital to go and execute and achieve that, and so that's why we went out to VCs. So we got our market research wrong, but had we've got our market research right, then VC wouldn't have been the right tool for that business. So I think VC is like the motivation, as you touched on, the motivations for venture capital firms, like the way their business model works is, they invest in 100 companies. They make almost all of their money out of the top sort of 3 or 4. If one of those 100 hits unicorn status, that's where they'll make most of their money. Mm-hmm. They might have 5 companies that return like 70 or 80% of their fund. Then they'll have another 30 or 40 companies that return a little bit of money. Another 20 that they get their money back, and then they'll lose money on probably nearly somewhere around half of their investments. And so you've just got to keep that in mind when you go and raise VC. Like, if you want to aim for that kind of unicorn status and your business has that potential, VCs are great. But if that's not what you're aiming for, then VCs won't be interested, because they're looking for every business they invest in. They want to invest in something that has the potential to be one of those unicorns that's going to return, multiples of their fund. They're not going to be interested if you're not aiming for that, and you shouldn't try and sell them a story aiming for that if that's not what your business would be, because it's only going to come back and bite you.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I know a lot of your investors were actually quite supportive after things went belly up, and spoke out against a lot of the media backlash. I think it was Elaine Stead from Blue Sky Investments. I think I've got the quote here. Basically saying they had to go. The investors that invested knew it was a high-risk investment and they couldn't make it work. They couldn't get to the scale needed to not have to raise money, and the dream just fizzled out. And that's essentially what it is. And VCs know this. Like you said, 4 out of 100 might return something. Maybe one will be that 100x return company that goes off to get to the unicorn status. And that's just the nature of the game. So it was really good to see that some of your investors actually came out and were quite supportive of you in the public domain. One thing I would love to touch on, which is perhaps a little bit more from the relationship part of the world in terms of, say, learning about that. So you founded this company with your then wife, Jodie Fox, but in 2014, actually 2012, you separated, but you continued to work together as co-founders of this company for another 7 years, which to me kind of seems like it ties in with this whole notion of conscious uncoupling, where I think that's a term Esther Perel coined, where instead of, say, breaking up, we're consciously uncoupling in terms of this relationship, but we're going to continue to maintain ties in a professional respect and perhaps maintain friendship. How did you maintain working together after being married previously? And I guess a lot of people just wouldn't be able to make that work.
Yeah. I mean, that term, you've nailed it. It was definitely a conscious uncoupling.
Yeah.
For Jodie and I, we met when we were 20 and 21 at university. We got married at 24 and 25. And then, by our late 20s, we're married sort of for 4 or 5 years. Then by our late 20s, we'd just grown in different directions in our 20s. And it wasn't a case. We still got on really well. We were still really good business partners. We were still really good friends, but it wasn't working as a married couple. And so, we went through all sorts of things like marriage counseling, and probably spent a good year from when we first started thinking about breaking up. Spent a good year trying to see how we could make it work. And that was a function of probably two things. One, we're the kind of people who don't like to quit at something that we've committed to, and secondly, we were really conscious of not screwing up Shoes of Prey by us separating, because we'd taken money from investors, we had all these employees, and we didn't want to mess things up for them, and the business kind of needed us both in it. And so, we just kind of worked. We spent a lot of time working through, can we make marriage work? Okay, if we can't, how can we ensure that we stay good friends and good business partners? And so, it was a very conscious uncoupling. And I think the fact that we went through that journey together, kind of in some ways made us stronger as friends and business partners. And we still talk almost weekly. 6 years, 7 years after divorcing, we're both remarried, we've both got kids. But the friend, even though we're not business partners anymore, the friendship is still there and really strong. I guess there were a few things that helped. It was the consciously working through everything, and it probably, also realistically, it also helped that it was a mutual decision to break up. Had it have been one person cheating on the other person or something like that, or had it have been one-sided in some way, I'm sure that would have made it a much harder experience. But we were. It was a mutual decision. We spent a lot of time working through it. It meant that we were able to make that work.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a beautiful story of conscious uncoupling. So now as you alluded to earlier, Fable Food Co is the company you're working on now. You're a plant-based meat startup, brisket, pulled pork, all that amazing stuff that you used to love but no longer eat because you're now a vegetarian. I'd love to know how that's going thus far and what you're doing differently based on the lessons learned from Shoes of Prey.
Yeah, so I went vegetarian 4.5 years ago, and for me it was kind of ethical, environmental, health reasons. I was in the thick of Shoes of Prey at the time. It wasn't anything more than just a personal decision. So then when I finished up with Shoes of Prey, took about 6 months off, just let my intellectual curiosity wander. I just ended up reading a lot about industrial animal agriculture and the meat alternative category, just because I was personally interested in it for all the reasons I went vegetarian. And then through that process, I just got of reading more about the space, just got more and more passionate about the idea of wanting to help contribute to ending industrial animal agriculture. And we don't have to go into it now, but there's just so many compelling reasons, particularly like health, environment, and ethics, of why we need to reduce our meat consumption as a species. And so wanting to contribute to that space, actually my initial thought was, I don't want to go start another business. I've just come out of Shoes of Prey. My self-confidence was low. I was like, all right, maybe I'll just take a couple of years. I'll go work for somebody else. I want to work in this category, so I'll go work for someone else in this category. But we wanted to move back to Australia to be closer to family with young kids. So I started talking to Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, some of the big European brands in the category, and no one was hiring in Australia. So then I started meeting with all the Australian companies in the space, and they were all like brand new startups and not hiring someone with my skill set. So I kind of came to this decision point of like, all right, well, if I either go back and get a more regular sort of corporate job, I'd worked at Google for a couple of years, maybe I'd go back to Google, or if I want to work in this category that I'm really passionate about, I'll need to go and start a business because there's no jobs in the space. And so I explored both paths. I did some interviews, and literally both paths made me feel literally physically ill. Like I didn't want to go work at a corporate because that was going to be boring.
Yeah. I
really didn't want to start another company because I think I had mild PTSD from at the ending of Shoes of Prey. But I figured, all right, I'll enter the space in Australia. I'll work on I'll see if I can start a business in the space. In doing that, I'll meet more people in the category. And if a job comes up, then I can make a decision on whether I keep doing my own thing or take a job. And yeah, it's kind of turned out that doing my own thing has kind of worked, and I've gotten over the lack of desire to do that. It's kind of switched completely 180. What we're doing, meat alternative to slow cooked meats, as we've touched on. The two key things, I guess, when I was thinking about, okay, if I'm going to start a business in the category, how can I serve a different segment of the market to where others are operating? So first thought was, okay, most people are doing burgers or beef mince or chicken. So first thought was, let's do a different type of meat, something that other people aren't replicating yet. And then my second thought was, I'm a pretty healthy eater. I shop at my local farmers markets, do a lot of my own cooking, bake my own sourdough, brew my own kombucha, eat a pretty healthy, minimally processed diet. And my thought was, could you make a meat alternative out of really natural, healthy, minimally processed products? And so, I had these two thoughts: replicate a different type of meat, do it in a really healthy, natural way. No food industry experience, so I went out and spoke to anyone in the food industry who was willing to speak with me and share their knowledge with me. That kind of led me down the path of, okay, maybe using mushrooms as a base ingredient for a meat product could be really interesting. Mushrooms, incredibly healthy, very sustainable to grow, and have a lot of the natural umami type flavors in them that are similar to meat. And so that led me to researching more in the mushroom space. I ended up meeting the two guys who are now my co-founders. So Jim Fuller grew up in Texas, grew up eating all those slow-cooked barbecue meats. Chef for 10 years, wanted to understand the science behind what he was cooking, so he went and studied chemical engineering and agricultural science. He ended up majoring in mycology, which is mushroom science, and then he's worked as a mushroom scientist for the last 12 years. So he's got this crazy skill set of being a chef and a mushroom scientist in one human being. And then Chris McLaughlin co-founded Australia's largest organic mushroom farm. He was Organic Farmer of the Year in 2018, Young Farmer of the Year in 2018, and he's worked in the mushroom space his whole career as well. So between Chris and Jim, they know everything there is to know about how to grow mushrooms, the science behind mushrooms, how to cook with mushrooms. And so they kind of cover off the technical side of the business, and I bring the kind of business, the business background, so together we developed our slow cooked meat alternative called Fable, and launched it late last year.
Fantastic. Well, I wish you all the best with Fable. I know we're just about out of time, so I just want to say thank you so much for your time, your insights, your humility, absolutely everything, Michael. I've really enjoyed this conversation. But before we go, where can people go to learn or connect with yourself and learn a little bit more about Fable Food Co?
Yeah, so probably best places to connect with me are LinkedIn or Twitter, and search for Michael Fox Fable, and you'll find me on those places. And then for Fable, we're probably most active on Instagram, so at Fable Food Co, or join our email newsletter on our website, www.fablefood.co. And then if you want to try the product, we were in a bunch of restaurants prior to coronavirus, but launching in retail now. So we're in 15 Harris Farm stores in New South Wales And then from mid-June onwards, we'll be in 600 Woolworths stores across the country, merchandised in the refrigerator with the other meat alternatives.
Perfect.
Yeah, great,
Well,
and great chatting to you, Steve. Thanks for your very insightful questions. I've really enjoyed the conversation too.
No, thank you so much, and I look forward to trying out the product. Until I do, I hope you stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thank you. You too. Cheers.